It was the winter of 1944, and the cold didn't just bite, it buried. We were somewhere in the Carpathian foothills, a patch of land no one would bother to name. Our unit was cut off after a skirmish that no one back home would ever hear about. No one knew. No telegram was sent, no list posted. I simply vanished from the map and from Emily's life. We were rounded up by a German patrol. No identification, no proper records, no Geneva Convention. Just a makeshift POW camp tucked deep in the woods, the kind they never wrote about in reports. There were no letters, no visits, no names, just numbers with frozen fingers and cracked lips. Every night I whispered her name in my mind to stay sane. I had nothing left but the hope that she still waited. I don't know how long we were there. Time didn't pass. It piled up. The war ended, or so we heard in whispers, long before we were found. When I finally made it back to the States in the spring of '46, my boots barely held together, and my soul even less so. I took a Greyhound as far as it would go, then hitchhiked home to upstate New York. The first words I heard when I reached my hometown still ring in my ears. She got married last fall to a Navy man. She thought you were dead. No one to blame. No one at fault. But I stood there, dusty and empty, wondering what hurt more. The years I lost in silence, or the fact that the one person I lived for had stopped waiting. This isn't a story about betrayal. It's not even a story about war. It's a story about memory, about love and silence, about how sometimes surviving is the loneliest thing a man can do. If this story touches you the way it touched me to write it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready. Because what comes next changes everything. Her house was still there, tucked at the end of Oak Ridge Lane, just like I remembered. The porch sagged a little more, and the shutters looked like they hadn't been painted since before the war. But it was there, solid, real. I stood at the edge of the driveway with my duffel bag at my feet, heart hammering like it did the day I first kissed her under the high school bleachers. Except now, I wasn't a boy coming home from football practice. I was a man who had seen death disappeared and clawed his way back from a place the world chose to forget. I didn't make it past the gate. The front door creaked open, and there she was. Emily's mother, holding a steaming kettle, wearing the same apron she always wore on Sundays. For a second she didn't move, just stared, like she was seeing a ghost. Then her hands trembled, and she nearly dropped the pot. "David," she whispered, the word catching in her throat like a prayer that had waited too long to be answered. "They all thought you were gone," she said, stepping forward slowly. "Even her, especially her." Her words struck like shrapnel. I'd imagined this moment differently 1,000 times. Her running into my arms, the tears, the laughter, the kind of reunion that books are written about. But this wasn't that. There were no violins playing, just the wind rustling the oak leaves and the kettle now resting awkwardly on the porch rail. Emily had married a Navy man. "A lieutenant," her mother said. "He came through town after the war ended, helping with some kind of veteran relocation project. He was calm," she told me, "solid, the kind of man who helped people stand up when everything around them was falling apart." She cried for months after the letters stopped. Her mother continued, eyes lowered, voice soft. "She went to church every week, prayed for your soul, lit candles, waited and waited. But there comes a point, David, when a woman has to stop waiting for ghosts." I nodded because what else could I do? I wanted to scream that I wasn't a ghost, that I had bled and starved and fought for every day I stayed alive in that prison, that I had memorized Emily's handwriting, traced the curve of her name in the dirt with frozen fingers, that she was the only reason I made it home at all. But standing there, looking into the eyes of the woman who once welcomed me in for meatloaf and sweet tea, I knew none of that mattered now. The house looked smaller, quieter, like it too had learned how to live with absence. I declined her offer to come in. I wasn't ready to see the furniture rearranged or the pictures taken down, or maybe worse, still hanging exactly where they'd always been. So I walked down past the old ball field where we used to sit on the hood of my dad's Chevy and dream about the future. Down the road where I gave her my class ring the night before I shipped out. Everything looked familiar but dulled, like someone had washed the color out of the world. I didn't cry. Not then. There was a numbness that came with surviving what I'd survived. A sense that the body protects itself by shutting certain emotions off like light switches, but I felt the crack, deep, low, like a fault line under the skin. I spent the next few days in a room above my cousin's auto shop, sleeping on a cot that smelled of oil and old tobacco. He hardly recognized me when I showed up at his door. I'd lost 30 pounds, grown a beard, had scars I didn't bother hiding. He asked if I'd seen Emily yet, and I just shook my head. I wasn't ready to explain. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling fan creaking slowly above me, and try to reconcile the life I thought I was returning to with the reality I had walked into. I'd think about her hands, how they felt in mine that night by the lake. I'd think about the way her voice rose when she laughed, how she used to tuck her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. And I'd wonder if she still did those things with him. I held on to a small piece of cloth, the one I'd carried with me through every mile of that war. I had torn it from my undershirt during one of the coldest nights in the camp, and used a charred stick to write her name across it, Emily, big crude letters that faded over time but never left me. That scrap had been my lifeline, my connection, my hope, and now it felt like the only piece of her I still had any right to. I didn't go back to see her, not yet. I wasn't ready to see the life she had built without me. I wasn't sure I could stand watching her smile at someone else the way she once smiled at me. Instead, I carried her with me, quietly, painfully, as I tried to figure out who I was in this new world where the war was over. But nothing really felt won. They never told us where we were. Not once, just loaded us into trucks under the cover of snow and silence, faces shoved into canvas sacks, and when the sacks finally came off, all we could see were trees. Endless, indifferent trees. Somewhere deep in the mountains, maybe Slovakia, maybe further, but the point wasn't to imprison us in a place, it was to remove. There were no signs, no fences with names, no red crosses. Barbed wire looped like a crown around a clearing of mud and rot, a few wooden huts, a watchtower that leaned slightly like it was tired of standing, and guards who rarely spoke, but always looked ready to strike. We weren't prisoners in the official sense. We weren't logged or recorded or acknowledged by anyone who mattered. We were numbers, we were shadows, we were forgotten. There was no radio, no mail, no news, no Red Cross visits. And the food, if you could call it that, was a grey mash of root starch and boiled water, sometimes less. We learned not to ask for more, not to ask at all. We learned quickly that questions only earned fists. Days didn't pass, they dissolved. Each morning we were herded into the snow or the dirt or the stone, depending on the season, and made to carry, build, destroy, then repeat. The Germans made us dig ditches that would later be filled in. They made us chop trees and move the logs in circles. Work for the sake of breaking the body, labor without logic, pain as routine. And still, I held on to her. I didn't have a photo. That got taken early, but I had her name. I had the sound of her laugh, the lilt of her voice, the memory of her running down the hill behind the church, barefoot, chasing the dog that once stole her glove. I talked to her in my mind when I couldn't talk to anyone else. I imagined letters from her and I answered them. I told her I was okay, that I would come home, that I loved her more now than I ever had. That kind of hope. It's dangerous. It gives you a reason to breathe, but it can also break your ribs from the inside when the silence goes on too long. One night, a fellow prisoner, a boy from Kansas whose name I never knew, handed me a scrap of cloth. I don't know how he'd kept it hidden, maybe from a sock or a pillowcase from another life. He said, "Write something, anything that matters. And so, with a bit of charred wood from the stove, I wrote her name in letters so big and shaky they looked like they were drowning. Emily. I folded it and kept it against my chest every night like it was scripture. I remember one morning, frost thick on the inside of the hut walls, my hands nearly blue. I unfolded the cloth just to look at the name, just to remind myself that there was still a world outside those trees, that someone, somewhere, might still believe in me. But as weeks turned into months, that belief started to wear thin. I started to forget the smell of her shampoo, the exact shade of her eyes, the scar on her knee from falling off her bike. And when those things began to fade, I felt something inside me go quiet, like a radio losing its signal. I watched men around me die slowly, some from sickness, some from cold, but most from something quieter. They gave up, stopped talking, stopped eating. One day, they just lay down and didn't get up again. And I understood it. I felt the edge of it, that slow unraveling where the idea of not existing seems easier than carrying all that hurt. But I held on, not because I was strong, not because I was brave, but because her name was still pressed against my heart. Because even if I'd forgotten the scent of her skin, I hadn't forgotten how it felt to be loved by her. Then one day, the guards were gone. Just like that, no orders, no explanation. The gate was open. The tower was empty. The snow still fell. The trees still stood. But the war apparently had ended months before. We were no longer prisoners. We were survivors, but surviving didn't feel like victory. I walked, hitched rides, took trains when I could, foraged, slept in barns. I wasn't in a rush because part of me already knew what was waiting or what wasn't. I clutched that cloth like a relic, watching the ink smear and fade, but never letting it go. Never once. When I reached New York, I was a skeleton in a soldier's skin. I didn't go home expecting parades, but I didn't expect to feel more lost than I had inside that camp. And what hurt the most was realizing the war had ended for everyone but me. I didn't go looking for her the next day or the day after. Truth is, I walked past her street twice before I ever had the nerve to turn my head. I told myself I didn't need to see her, that I already knew how the story ended, but that was a lie. I needed to see her, not because I expected anything, but because I needed proof that she was still real, that I hadn't imagined her, that I hadn't survived all that time just chasing a ghost. It was a Sunday morning when I finally saw her. I remember because the church bells were ringing, that same small chapel just off Main Street, where we used to meet every week. I stood across the street, half hidden by a lamppost and my own fear. My coat was too thin. My hands were shaking, but I waited. And then she stepped out. She walked out of that chapel like nothing had changed except everything had. She was older. Not old, but older. Not in the way time wears down the skin, but in the way grief settles into the posture. Her shoulders were still proud, but her eyes moved carefully, like someone who knew the world had sharp edges. A little boy walked beside her, skipping slightly, his hand in hers. He looked about 4. Her son. His coat was buttoned all wrong, the kind of mistake a father might have noticed, and I wondered if her husband had left early for work, or maybe stayed home that day. She laughed softly as she fixed the buttons, and that laugh, God, that laugh, it hit me like a punch to the ribs. Then I saw him, a tall man in uniform, navy, like I'd heard. He came out behind them and placed his hand gently on her back, just above the waist, the way I used to do when no one was watching, and she didn't flinch, she didn't move away. She leaned into it just slightly, like you do when it's familiar, when it's home. I didn't realize I was crying until I tasted salt on my lips. I hadn't cried when I left the camp, not when I came home, not even when her mother told me she'd married. But seeing her there, laughing, living without me, that did it. I didn't say a word. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I watched them walk down the street, the boy hopping on cracks in the sidewalk, the man saying something that made her smile, and I memorized every second of it, knowing it wasn't mine. knowing it would never be. I turned away and walked home, if you could call it that. The room above the garage didn't feel like anything but a roof. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my boots for what felt like hours. Then I took out that piece of cloth, the one with her name, faded and frayed, and held it in my hands like it was the last true thing I owned. I didn't cry again, not then. Just sat there hollow, because it wasn't just that I'd lost her, it was that I'd lost the world we built in letters that never got sent. That I had survived for something that no longer existed, and the worst part, she looked happy. It was late spring by the time she came, the kind of day where the sun hides just enough to make you wonder if it'll ever come back out. I was sitting by the window, drinking weak coffee out of a chipped mug, when I heard the knock. 3 soft taps. Not urgent, not casual. The kind of knock that carries history in it. The kind that makes your chest tighten before your mind catches up. I opened the door, and there she was. She stood there in a navy blue coat, her hands folded, eyes cast downward. She hadn't changed much since the last time I saw her, but there was something in the way she stood, a hesitation, a stillness, that told me this wasn't just a visit. It was a reckoning. "I heard you were back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside, and she walked in like she'd never been there before, even though we both knew she had in 100 ways, over 100 days, back when our lives were still wrapped up in letters and long walks and promises we thought we'd keep. We sat across from each other. There was no tea, no polite small talk, just silence that wrapped around us like fog, dense and unwilling to lift. "I didn't know what to say," she began. "I didn't know if I had the right to say anything." "You do," I said, and I meant it, because she had always had that right. She looked down at her hands. They were the same hands I used to hold behind the barn, calloused from the cold, strong from carrying too much. She twisted her wedding band and stared at the floor. "I waited, David. I did. Every day. I went to church. I prayed. I lit candles. I told myself you'd walk through the door, and then..." The silence grew too loud. People started telling me to move on, that I had to live. And I hated them for it, but after a while, I stopped hating. I didn't interrupt. What could I say? That I remembered every night I spent writing to her in my mind, that I lived on the memory of her voice, her laugh, her letters I made up in my head, that I died a little the day I realized she no longer believed I was alive. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said. "He was kind. He helped my father fix the fence. He brought sugar when the rations ended. He didn't ask for anything. He just stayed." I pulled the cloth from my pocket, the one with her name written in fading charcoal. I unfolded it slowly and placed it on the table between us. She looked at it like it was something sacred. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. "I wrote that in the camp," I said. "The night I thought I'd never make it out." She pressed it to her chest, and for the first time, she cried. Not loud, not messy, just tears that rolled quietly, like grief that had waited too long to be released. David, maybe it would have been easier," she said through the tears. "I could have buried you in my heart. I could have mourned. But not knowing, living in that space between hope and loss, it broke me." She looked up, her eyes rimmed in red. "Do you hate me?" I shook my head, slowly, deliberately. "No, I never did. I couldn't. You did what you had to do to survive, same as I did." She stood after that. She held the cloth in her hands like it was something too fragile to fold. At the door, she turned to me one last time. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything, for not waiting longer, for not believing harder. I didn't know how." And then she was gone. I sat there for a long time after, staring at the spot where she'd been. Her scent lingered in the room, like the aftertaste of a dream, and I realized something in that moment. This wasn't closure. It wasn't a new beginning. It was a quiet ending, one that didn't need fanfare or forgiveness, just a soft knock on a door and the silence that follows. I never went back to her house, not after that last visit. Not because I was angry, not because I couldn't forgive her, but because I knew, in the quiet that followed, that some doors were meant to close softly and stay closed. She had a life now, a real one, with a child, a home, routines I no longer fit into, and I had what was left, the memories, the cloth, the silence that had shaped me more than any battle ever could. I moved to a small town a few hours north, got a job repairing fences and fixing broken windows, things that could be mended, things I could control. People there didn't ask too many questions. They saw the look in my eyes and knew enough to leave the past alone. I saw her once more, from a distance. She was walking her boy to school. He was older now, maybe 7 or 8. He looked like her, same determined jaw, same quick smile. She didn't see me, or maybe she did and chose not to react. I watched them disappear around the corner, then turned and walked the other way. And that was enough. That was all I needed. Years passed. Her husband died. I heard it through a neighbor. Car accident, I think. Part of me wondered if this was life's way of giving me another chance. If maybe, after all this time, we could pick up the thread we lost. But I didn't go to her, because too much had already passed between us, because we were no longer who we had been. Sometimes love isn't about reclaiming what was lost. It's about honoring what once lived. I never married. Not because I didn't try, but because no one else ever felt like home. I carried her with me in small ways, the way I folded shirts, the way I held my coffee cup, the way I paused at every church bell, thinking of that morning when I saw her with her son. She became part of my rhythm, part of the silence I learned to live with. Every year, on the day I came home, I lit a candle, not for me, for her, for us, for what might have been and what never was. I didn't need photographs, I didn't need letters. I had the cloth, I had the name, I had the memory of the girl who ran barefoot across a field, laughing like the world couldn't touch her. That was enough. Now my hands shake when I try to hold a pen. My breath shortens on cold mornings, but I still have that cloth, still folded in the drawer beside my bed. The letters are almost gone now, faded into the fabric like everything else. But I see them. I always will. Emily. The war took me from her, and life took her from me. But it was her, without knowing, without meaning to, who kept me alive when everything else inside me wanted to die. She may have stopped waiting, but I never stopped remembering. And in the end, that's what love really is. We share new stories every day, true stories that move and inspire.